welcome back to more Emily exploring her bookshelves, and something a little bit different this time. Now this is one of my favourite books, The Princess and the Goblins by George MacDonald. George MacDonald was a Victorian writer of fantasy and fairy tales. He was also a theologian and a Christian minister, so in a lot of his works you can it's almost like a theological discussion of things like the nature of the soul. One of his darker fantasy novels is called Lilith. And yes, that is Lilith, first wife of Adam. And it's all about the nature of redemption. But The Princess and the Goblins is probably, well, I haven't read all of his stuff, but it's very fairy tale. It's very much a book written for children. And it's a book that I absolutely loved and still do love. This edition is my mother's copy that she had as a child. You can see it's an old puffin book. And it has the original illustrations by Arthur Hughes, one of the pre-Raphaelites, and he illustrated this. He illustrated a number of MacDonald's works, including The Princess and the Goblins. And there's also the sequel, The Princess and Cardi, though this one has illustrations by Helen Stratton. Slightly different style. The thing about this book is it has stayed with me since I first came across it on audio cassette, aged about maybe 5, and I both loved it and it terrified me. I can remember listening to it and my room was dark and I'd gone out and I was sitting on the landing by the stairs because the landing light was on, because I was too frightened to be in my room in the dark, but I also didn't want to stop listening to the story. And I didn't want to go down and tell my parents, because if they found out I was being so frightened by the book, well then they might take it away from me. There are images in this book that have stayed with me for my whole life. One of the characters in it is a woman who lives up in the tallest castle. She's the old queen, and she's described as being both old and young, and she spins moonlight into cloth, and that's an image that has just stuck in my head all my life. In the sequel, in Cardi and the Goblins, The Princess and Cardi, there is a fire and it's almost made of roses, or it looks like it's made of burning roses, and it burns away all deception and lies. And this isn't a spoiler, it happens very close to the beginning of the book, but the character Cardi is persuaded to put his hands into this fire and it burns away all lies, and then anytime he touches something, he can feel the truth of it. For instance, he meets this small creature, it looks like a sort of monster, but when it puts its hand in his, he can feel that it feels like the hand of a child, because this creature isn't evil, it's of no danger, has a pure soul. But he later meets a man, and when he feels the man's hand feels rough and leathery, even though it looks smooth and soft, because the man, well, he's not a very nice man. So there are images like that that have just stuck in my head. The Princess and the Goblins. It follows Princess Irene. She is the titular princess. She's aged about 8 and she lives in this castle. She doesn't live with her father, the king, partly because he's got a kingdom to run and also he is still very much grieving for her mother. So she's lived all of her life in this castle on the edge of the kingdom. But there are also goblins. Now, it might raise the question of why do you put the princess in the place where there are goblins? But let's not ask that question. The goblins live under the ground, and it's said that at one stage they and the humans both lived together. They might have even both been one species, but something happened that caused the goblins to split away and go under the ground. And this is something you find echoed in a lot of fantasy, fairy tale, folklore, fairy lore stuff, the idea of fairies being driven under the ground or having to go underground for some reason, and that being the reason that they don't particularly like humans, because the goblins really detest the humans in this book. Most of the people who have to interact with the goblins are the miners. Cardi, who's a main character in the book and is in the title of the sequel, he's the son of one of the miners, and he has discovered that the goblins, they hate songs. They hate music, they hate rhyme, which is very unusual for sort of fairy, fae-esque style creatures. They normally love music. But the goblins, they detest rhymes and things so much that if the miners think the goblins are coming, because the goblins love to cause trouble for the miners, to try to block up one of their tunnels or cause a cave-in, they will start to shout and scream and sing rhymes and nonsense because it annoys the goblins so much that it gives the miners time to escape. Irene meets Curdie when he rescues her in such a fashion. Irene and her nurse are out enjoying the grounds, and it starts to get dark. They're too far away from the castle, and as they're trying to get home, a group of goblins come out and try to attack them, because Irene, being the princess, would be a prime target. Thankfully though, they bump into Curdie, who chants and sings and stamps and drives the goblins away, and that forms a friendship between the two of them. Curdie then later finds out that the goblins are plotting to overthrow the kingdom, to kidnap Princess Irene and force her to marry the prince. Interestingly, Curdie also finds out that the goblin queen is the only goblin to wear shoes, because goblins don't wear shoes. They have no toes. Very odd. And also their weak point is their feet. So you would imagine that they would wear shoes, but they don't, due to pride and fashion. You see, the king of the goblins was at one stage married to a human woman. They don't go into the detail of how this happened, which I would find very interesting, and might have a Labyrinth fanfic somewhere in the back of my head about. But anyway, the Goblin King was married to a human woman, and she wore shoes. She then died after giving birth to the current Goblin Prince, who is half goblin, half human. And when the king remarried, the second queen would not be outdone by the first, so insists that she wear shoes, and that no other goblin wear shoes, because only the queen goblin is allowed to wear shoes, which is again one of those things that stuck in my head. The goblins have a plan where they plan to drown all the miners by causing a cave-in and a flood. They plan to kidnap the Princess Irene, force her to marry the Goblin King and take over the kingdom. And with the help of Curdie, Princess Irene, and Princess Irene's great something grandmother, who is also called Irene and is somewhere between an angel, a fairy and something else, they go on an adventure to stop this happening. And I love this book. I really adore this book. Reading through it again as an adult, sometimes there's little bits that are sort of like, yes, Victorian talking to children. But for the most part, it's brilliant and I highly recommend it. And in fact, I love this book so much that I'm going to try to do something new. See, the book is broken up nicely into little short chapters. So I'm going to record myself reading a chapter each and put them up as a little series where you can have the book read to you. You can also, it's in public domain, it's out of copyright, so you can easily find a copy for yourself online. You can order yourself a print copy if you like. I absolutely adore this book. I really love it and cannot recommend it highly enough. Also, if you like fantasy and you like particularly early fantasy, check out MacDonald's other work. He has loads of books. He was also a bit of a mentor to Lewis Carroll, author of Alice in Wonderland, G.K. Chesterton, who has the great quote about we need stories about dragons not to prove that they exist, but that they can be defeated. And again, another great father of fantasy. He cited MacDonald as a huge influence on his work. Highly recommend you check him out. He's got some brilliant books. Books for children, books for adults, books for both. And I am going to start reading this book. So hopefully this will be enjoyable.